Sepsis and antibiotic stewardship in North Devon. I think there's a few principles that we went through around designing antibiotic protocols for use in ED. So the first is that when people present the ED, there's considerable uncertainty about what's actually wrong with them. So any guideline that requires a diagnostic label is probably going to be wrong. So when we look at what happens to people, certainly in the post-take ward round diagnosis or the discharge diagnosis, it differs from the ED diagnosis in at least a third of cases. And I've got some blood culture data which will sort of back that up. I mean, it's not surprising really that in the first hour you don't know what's going on. So I would say that any protocol that relies on a diagnosis is likely to be unsafe. For us, so that when we started doing this work, our protocols for sepsis of unknown origin were relatively complex. And I think it's interesting that we all have different approaches to this problem. And if you've got a pen allergy, then they're even more complicated and even more toxic. I think the data on rifampicin is fascinating, that it seems like a good antibiotic until you see that it increases mortality. So, and this is the bit that we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about, I think. So particularly with IV antibiotics, the amount of time taken for nurses to administer this is opportunity cost when they could be doing something else. So I think just spending more time thinking about how these things that we recommend are actually delivered. So the alternatives to our complex protocols are a broad spectrum, and we've still got the penicillin allergy issue. And of course, we've got this background of increasing resistance, especially in gram-negative. So, you know, for us, our augmentin resistance is about 20%. Whether you believe that's true clinical resistance or not is another matter, but even Tazosin's now going about 10% resistance. So at what point do you tip over into saying that these antibiotics are no longer fit for purpose? So the only this routine antibiotic that we could use for gram-negative resistance in the ED with the 100% for us, sensitivity would be Ertapenem. Is that a good idea? And I think this is, I'm sure you've all seen this, is that once an antibiotic's been started, it is very difficult to stop it. So you see, somebody heard a crackle at the left base in the ED, started some augmentin for pneumonia, and then it's reviewed in the post-take ward round, clear chest x-ray, diagnosis cap, and you think, well, once it's very difficult, and I think we all struggle that as microbiologists to some extent, going around stopping other people's prescriptions. Well, it's the bit that I most enjoy about my job, actually, but it makes us all feel a little bit nervous, doesn't it, about challenging another professional's view. So these were what I thought were the characteristics of the ideal ED sepsis antibiotic. So it should be agnostic to the diagnosis. And for me, that means cover the big five. So that's pneumococcus, group A strep, Staph aureus, E. coli. And I got meningococcus now. I was wondering whether that's actually should come out, because I think that's possibly a slightly different disease and possibly quite rare. But anyway, it needs to sort of cover those bugs. It does not need to cover Pseudomonas, and it does not need to cover Legionella. But there's lots of other bugs that can kill you quite quickly, but you can't cover them all. What about malaria? What about flu? All of these things that we ought to be thinking about. But for that initial antibiotic that you're going to try and give within an hour, these are really the things that are in my mind anyway. It should be simple, so there should be no significant contraindications, so no allergy issues, you shouldn't really have to think about anything, you should just be able to give it, and it should be easy to mix and administer. So Tazosin, people really don't like Tazosin in the ED. I think nurses don't like it, it just takes time. And then it shouldn't be in any other of our hospital protocols, so that creates that sort of fire break between the ED and subsequent care. So once you've prescribed this antibiotic, there should be no use of it anywhere else in the hospital. So as soon as you see it anywhere else, you can just stop it. And it should be safe. So I guess it needs to be licensed for the common infections. Probably ought to think about C. diff a little bit. So these were the three antibiotics that we felt fell into that category. So Ertapenem was one, it's very easy to give, but it's a penem, feeling that when people give Ertapenem, they quickly learn that it's very like Ertapenem, so they can just switch it. It counts against our target. It's an infusion, still possibly allergy issues, and essentially it's a broad spectrum antibiotic that we probably don't want to be using. So chloramphenicol, it's very easy to give, and really the only worries about it were our own worries about aplastic anemia, but actually from my perspective, this is a 1 in 10,000 risk or something. We don't worry about fulminant hepatotoxicity with beta-lactams. There's all sorts of catastrophic things that can happen when you give any drug. So I wasn't very anxious, but then I wasn't brought up in the generation that ever saw it. So and our gram-negative resistance to chloramphenicol is about somewhere between 5 and 10%. Fosfomycin, used in other countries for sepsis, really used here, not in that context, but has a license for all those conditions, but quite hard to mix it up. So this is our protocol, so promoting a watching and wait in the low early warning score, so using the early warning score to risk stratify. So once you suspect an infection, if you're in a sort of moderate group, you should do some thinking. They should not get an antibiotic. And if you're in the severe group, then you should do your sepsis 6, including this sepsis antibiotic, and then reassess. And then after that reassessment, you then have to decide what you're going to do. So you make a diagnosis, and if you can't make a diagnosis, then we do say go on to the sepsis of unknown origin antibiotics, or stop. It's perfectly safe. So we did that by just, so rather than taking it through ethics, we just changed our guidelines every month and audited what happened. And so this is, there was a push in ED around other things, but this is just time to administer. This is auditing people who've had a blood culture sent to the lab, what had happened to them. So somebody had thought about infection in these patients. So before we started using these antibiotics, we were sort of, I don't know why I had time to antibiotics in days. I think I was looking at the slide and I couldn't remember what an hour was. I think it's somewhere well below those 3 bars on the left. And then just by changing to a sepsis antibiotic, we generally were faster. And possibly, so we switched in about March 17, possibly we were slightly better at withholding antibiotics in the ED. And that's slipped, I have to say. And this is what the nurses felt. They loved chloramphenicol, really easy to give. They quite liked Ertapenem and they hated Fosfomycin. So on the back of that, we now use shed loads of chloramphenicol in our ED. And I think we're probably unusual in doing that. But I haven't seen any aplastic anemia yet. I quite like it. And that is my approach to sepsis in North Devon. And we'll come on to some blood culture, some antibiotic usage data later. So my second thing is, which will follow in what Mike has to say, is really we do need on the back of that to pay attention to diagnostics, and the key diagnostic in sepsis is the blood culture pathway. So this is really looking at some regional audit we did in the southwest, so 13 hospitals, and what we did to audit this is we looked at people who'd had an E. coli bacteraemia in a blood culture taken in the ED, and we just looked at how long it had taken to load a blood culture from the time taken to presentation to the time to be loaded on the machine, because that takes in, from a patient's perspective, they don't care where the delay is, that bottle needs to go on the machine as quickly as possible. And you can see some substantial variation. So this is the 13 hospitals, the percentage loaded, so the dark bars is within 2 hours, the lighter bars is between 2 and 4 hours. And some hospitals really almost never managing to load bottles within 4 hours. And then some hospitals on the left managing to load most. And it's interesting to look at who they are. So we've got Western on the very left, whose ED shuts at 5, so they don't have an issue with overnight blood cultures. So that's how they deal with the problem. You've then got us, so we load blood culture, so we make sure that biomedical scientists so blood sciences BMSs load blood cultures 24/7, and our ED is very close to our lab, so it's relatively easy for that transport, so it seems to work well. And then you've got Taunton and Yeovil, so So for people that say that hubs and spokes don't work, I would push back at that slightly and say they can work if you design them properly. So Yeovil is a spoke lab of Taunton with, and they had a massive problem with loading in a timely fashion, but they then put a satellite in, they've got BMSs loading 24/7, and these things are perfectly achievable, but you just have to know your service, and you have to, well, I guess you have to decide, is this something you want to focus on, because it is solvable, I think, in any situation, just with a bit of imagination. I mean, some of these labs are loading up to half of their blood cultures in over 16 hours. And well, as we'll come on to, I mean, so as a GERFT lead, it's a sort of, it will be a joy to go into those places and say, talk to us about why you don't think that's very important and what are you doing about it. And it might be a data issue, but this is why it's important. So this is data. This is looking at, in calendar days, how long it took from the admission to unload that positive blood culture. So this is the time to it actually being gram stained, essentially. So if you load on the day of admission, so this is the left-hand bar, then the bottom bit of that bar is those blood cultures flagging on the same day. So if you load it on the same day, then 20% of those blood cultures will flag on the same day. And then you need to think about, does your service allow those to be taken off? So some labs will shut at 5 and some labs will not shut at 5. So all sorts of issues there. And then a very small percentage at the top flagging not the next day but the day after. So essentially 2 calendar days after admission. If you load it later than that, then obviously they can't flag on the same day, and most of these, and a substantial proportion, 20-30% flagging more than 2 days after admission. So just looking at that in the effect of rapid loading, to me, if you do rapid load, then you can shift 20% from day after to the next day, and then another 20% into the same day. Does it matter? So I would say yes, this is just us looking at some local data, 102 cases of bacteraemia, and blood cultures had a significant impact on diagnosis in 25%. So this is going back to that idea that you can't make an accurate diagnosis in the ED. So in 10 cases, people were honest and said, I don't know what's going on. And these things were diagnosed that were not clinically apparent until the blood culture, we've all been there. You go and it's very easy as a microbiologist to go, isn't it? It's obviously UTI when you've got a gram-negative and you ask them the right questions. But that's useful. But actually, I think what was even more interesting was that it's important for correcting diagnosis. So these were the wrong diagnoses in 15 cases, switching to all of this sort of stuff when you've got the blood culture result back. And in 10 cases, that was on the basis of the gram stain. So the gram stain is, there's some really basic stuff in microbiology that you don't need moldy toffs to do this. You don't need rapid diagnostics. You just need to do the basics properly. And that, I think, is that hobby horse next. So this is getting on to some of the GERF stuff. So what has all this done to things that actually matter? So as a patient, I don't really care about how long it takes to load a blood culture, but I do care about dying and how long I'm going to be in hospital and whether I'm going to be readmitted. And after you've talked to people, most people don't care that much about antibiotic issues. They will sort of say they care about resistance, but I think it's more for us to worry about. And but certainly what has it done to antibiotic usage? So the Get It Right First Time program, I don't know who's aware of it. It's so I think it's up to about 33 or 35 work streams now. Started off in orthopedics, just looking at important variation and showing that actually if you just look at variation across the country and you talk about it in a sort of peer-to-peer manner, shoulder to shoulder I think they call it, then you can get some interesting change. So it's partly around holding people to account a bit more in it's going back to things like CPA, I guess, isn't it? It's about having people who understand talking about things in interesting ways and not being too dogmatic. So lots of data sources to look at variation, all of them generally well, you can imagine what the data looks like, but so we've got data from HARES, so hospitals, episode statistics, PHE, NHSC, you've given us some blood culture data from Mike, infectious disease and pregnancy screening. The transfusion stuff from a shot, I think, will be almost the most interesting thing we get, actually. I mean, it is fascinating how we waste blood, and anyway, that will be an interesting bit of that bit. And then there's a questionnaire. So all labs have been sent a questionnaire, which is long, but hopefully interesting. So the graphs I'm going to show now. So this is all new data. I've only thought about this as I put this together yesterday, really. So, and some of the graphs aren't right. So you can see it's supposed to be a funnel plot. I have no idea why the funnel plot has failed. But some of this is fingertips data. Some of it is other data that's been nicked from other places, but slightly reimagined. And what I've got in my mind here, so to me this is essentially the antibiotic stewardship report that I write for our trust board, which nobody reads, but it's about to say, you don't need to look here, that everything's fine in North Devon, or it's not fine in North Devon, and this is what we intend to do about it. So if you look at us, so we're the red dot here, so all the other hospitals in the country are the other dots, just looking at DDDs per 1,000 bed days for trusts, and I'm sure there'll be lots of reasons why people are outliers, but some of them are very big outliers, and that will be interesting to explore. So we sit bang on the mean, which is interesting if you look at fingertips. If you look at fingertips quintiles, I don't know if people have used it, we look fantastic on the quintiles because they're not adjusted for size, which I hadn't realised actually. So I've been going around saying North Devon is marvellous. We use far less antibiotics than everybody else, but it's just because we're quite small. So actually, we just sit bang in the mean, which is, I guess, okay. But it would be what I think would be more interesting, rather than focusing on some of the people that are high. It's what's going on in some of these low hospitals. I know that we benchmark against places like Airedale. It would just be fascinating to know what they're doing, because I think they're very low users of antibiotics. So this is our narrow spectrum antibiotic usage. This is the percent from access class. I don't remember what's in it, but it's the narrow spectrum good stuff. So we're relatively high users of narrow spectrum, as you might expect for a small DGH. Our broad spectrum usage is low, so we don't use a huge amount of carbapenem on the left, and we use very little tazocin. I just can never think why you'd ever want to use tazocin, apart from in neutropenic sepsis. Just sure there are some good reasons. And then some resistance data. So, and I thought this was interesting when we did it. Actually, everybody just sits in the middle of these funnels. So for gentamicin, Cipro, tazocin, third generation Kefs, there's very few outliers, and actually it does make you wonder whether we really do need localised protocols quite as much as we talk about, actually. But anyway, we sit sort of, I guess it's interesting that our gent resistance is a little bit high. We do use quite a lot of gent. But then no tazocin, and we've got, who knows, but interesting. I think you'd obviously be interested in C. diff rates, and I'm sure you get this in all sorts of different ways from different people. So I think it's just, to me, it's just a sort of balancing measure that's just put it in with the other stuff. It's something that people ought to think about. That was a relatively high year for us, but so the positivity rate, I think, is interesting. If you don't, if you're below that line, you're probably under testing, possibly under testing, but a complex, I accept. So the sepsis stuff, so this is new. So I don't know whether people have come across the work of Matt and Ada Kim at Imperial's done a suspicion of sepsis stuff, which I was massively critical of. But actually I think he's right in that, I mean, if you just look at a sepsis code, we code really badly. So actually what other codes are associated with sepsis? And I think the trouble, and he's completely open about this, they just put in all sorts of things which were not infections like ATN, but then tubular necrosis, but then things that I'm not sure whether really should be in the sort of this sepsis thing, like a sore throat. I think there's some things now anyway. So I've taken it out. So I've written a blog on this, and we'll probably try and publish it, but just modified this SOS code, so just to get hospital codes that are associated with infections, so CAP and all that sort of stuff. Anyway. So here is a plot of our number of emergency admissions with our percent of those that are modified SOS code on them. So people running at about 15% of hospital emergency admissions are infections, serious infections, and we're a bit low on that. And then the next graph is, so this is mandatory surveillance data, so looking at the number of emergency admissions and then plotting your frequency of E. coli bacteremia on here. And we are high. And I would argue that you want to be high because it shows you're doing your blood cultures properly. So I actually do not believe that low is in any way good at all. Unless you've done something radical to your gram-negative sepsis avoidance, I would say that if you're low, you're probably just not doing blood cultures properly. But that, you know, I'm sure there are some of those people who are actually doing some good stuff, but I think it's probably a bad place to be. So blood cultures and sepsis. So this is, it's not great data this, but this is just the number of blood cultures that you are reporting that you use to PHE versus your number of infections, and it may or may not be interesting. But here you can see the number of blood cultures with and the percent of those that flag with E. coli from a community source. So again, if you're high on that, so if you're sort of running up to the 30%, you're either extremely good at diagnosing E. coli sepsis on presentation or you're not taking enough blood cultures. And then, so you will not see this data, so this is mortality data, which has always been something that I've banged on about, and I think, you know, how do we know whether, you know, we write protocols, but we've got no idea whether they actually have any benefit to patients or not. So you know, when I've changed the chloramphenicol, it would be quite nice to know whether that people are all dying of sepsis. So this is just number of admissions on the x-axis and then percent mortality in hospital in those, and we sit bang in the middle on that. And then this is data from, so this is new data from PHE linking your mandatory surveillance to the NHS spine. So seeing how many people who you've reported with an E. coli bacteremia have died in the next 30 days, which again I think is probably quite a useful thing to know. And there's a nice graph. So we sit just below the mean. Sort of length of stay and readmission rates. So this is length of stay. So mean, if you come in with a suspicion of sepsis diagnosis, your mean length of stay is just under 8 days, so we sit well below that. The other trusts in South 1 are some of those other green bars. I don't know which ones you are, but so I guess in the South we're relatively low. I mean, I guess, you know, this is probably around hospital organisation rather than sepsis management, but some interesting things. And then the readmission rates on the next graph. And then some antibiotic use. I mean, this data, what I get from this data, so this is sequence stuff, antibiotic usage and sepsis. So this is asking your ED to essentially audit who got antibiotics within an hour. So we only had 2 cases where we said that they fulfill sepsis criteria and they both got antibiotics within an hour, so we have 100%. I think it's, what I find most interesting is how when people set up these national data programs, they do not think nearly enough about how you define sepsis. So this is just garbage data, isn't it? I mean, it's just, you know, what... Anyway, I can't believe we have 200-fold less cases of sepsis than another hospital, whoever that is down there. So, and it's no wonder they look bad. So this is not comparable data, and to me, and one of the recommendations of the national report will almost certainly be, at a national level, we've got to pay far more attention to the data we collect and make sure that it's useful. And then this is just the antibiotic review in 72 hours at stop or switch. So I don't know how useful that is. That sort of meteor, that's where that shows, that's actually an attempt at showing historical data. So we've shifted to being slightly better at switching at 72 hours. But I think that actually doesn't take into account that we just didn't do anything for most of them. So, and that's it. So that's the GIRF data. So if anybody wants to talk about that at any time, this is all still, the data packs are going to be produced over the next month or so, really. So if any of that data sort of lights your fire, that'd be good to know about. There's data that you think's not in there. So the data that will go in there that's not there yet is some of the data from Mike's national survey that he'll talk about later. So we've got all of that at trust level for those of you that filled it in, which is probably quite a substantial amount of you. And there we go.
very much.